My name is Samuel Whitaker, and I was 68 years old the summer. My cousins decided I was too old to manage anything that mattered. The Whitaker estate has stood at the edge of town for nearly a century, perched on rolling acres of oak and stone walls our grandfather laid with his own hands. It isn't a mansion with glittering chandeliers, but it carries a weight our family has always understood. A sprawling farmhouse of brick and timber, barns with rafters blackened from years of hay dust, and fields that once grew more corn than the county knew what to do with. The estate wasn't just land. It was memory, sweat, and lineage. When my father died, the responsibility fell to me, not because I demanded it, but because I was the eldest who never left. I stayed in Maplewood, while others chased lives in cities, managing boardrooms and cocktail hours. I remained, paying the property taxes on time, keeping the roof mended when storms tore shingles loose, making sure the barns didn't collapse under the weight of neglect. Some years were lean, others less so, but I kept the Whitaker name attached to the soil it was built upon. My cousins, however, saw the estate differently. To them, it was a relic, an asset waiting to be cashed in. They grew up visiting in summers, running through the orchards, eating peaches until their fingers were sticky. But as adults, their visits became rarer, their words sharper. They saw the land as a payday. I saw it as a covenant. One warm June afternoon, I sat on the porch overlooking the fields, a glass of iced tea sweating in my hand. The air smelled of cut grass and lilacs, and the sound of cicadas buzzed like an old radio. That's when Daniel and Martin, two of my younger cousins, pulled into the drive in a silver SUV that looked out of place against the dirt road. They got out wearing tailored slacks and sunglasses, as though overdressed for a business pitch. "Sam," Daniel said, his smile too polished, "we need to talk." I invited them onto the porch, poured them tea out of courtesy, and listened as they spoke in practiced turns. "You've been carrying this place a long time," Martin began, leaning back in his chair. "We all admire the work you've done." "Truly," Daniel added quickly. "But times are changing. The estate could be worth millions if sold. Developers are looking for properties just like this. You're almost 70, Sam. Wouldn't it be better to let someone else take it from here?" Their words landed like gnats buzzing around my ears, irritating, persistent, impossible to ignore. I sipped my tea and let the silence answer them first. "I'm not interested in selling," I finally said. "This land stays Whitaker land, as long as I draw breath." Daniel chuckled softly. "You can't hold on to it forever. Management takes energy, resources, and let's be honest, Sam, you don't have either in abundance these days." There it was, the insult dressed as concern. Too old, too weak, too irrelevant. I looked at their polished shoes, their manicured hands, and thought about the calluses I'd carried since I was 15. Men who had never lifted a bale of hay telling me I wasn't fit to guard the soil that raised us all. "You've made your point," I said, standing slowly. My knees creaked, but my voice was steady. "But understand this, you may see land, I see legacy, and I won't let you take it." They exchanged a glance, thin smiles playing at the corners of their mouths. It was the kind of look men share when they already believe they've won. As they drove away, dust trailing behind their shiny SUV, I felt the air shift. Their words weren't just idle suggestions, they were the beginning of something darker, something calculated. That evening, I opened the old ledger my father had kept, the one that smelled faintly of ink and tobacco. Inside were deeds, receipts, and records stretching back 3 generations. I ran my hand over the faded ink, grounding myself in the truth that paper holds power. What I didn't know then was that my cousins understood this too. And while I trusted the pages in that ledger, they were preparing papers of their own, papers that would try to erase me from my own bloodline. But I've lived long enough to know truth has a way of rising through the cracks. And when their betrayal came, the soil of this estate and the judge's gavel would remind them whose hands had kept it alive all these years. Summer stretched on, the kind of season where the air itself seemed lazy, but beneath the quiet, I could feel the ground shifting. My cousins had planted seeds of doubt, not in the soil but in the ears of anyone willing to listen. At the farmer's market, I overheard them once, Daniel speaking too loudly near the strawberry stall. "It's a shame, really. Uncle Sam's heart is in the right place, but he's just too old to handle all that land. Somebody needs to step in before it goes to waste." The woman selling berries nodded sympathetically, the kind of nod given when one doesn't know the whole story. I walked past without stopping, but my jaw clenched tight. Soon whispers traveled faster than the summer wind. At the diner, I noticed conversations pause when I entered. Too much for him at his age, one man murmured when he thought I was out of earshot. At church, even Reverend Clay, a kind man, pulled me aside after service. "Sam, folks are saying you've been carrying the estate too long. Maybe you should think about succession." Succession, a polite word for being pushed aside. What my cousins didn't understand, or perhaps refused to, was that I had spent decades weaving this estate into my daily breath. Every fence post I'd driven, every barn I'd mended, every tree I'd pruned was an act of stewardship. You don't simply hand that over like a baton in a race. You live it until your last step on the soil. One Sunday, Ruth, our eldest aunt, and one of the last ties to our parents' generation, hosted a family supper. The long oak table groaned under casseroles, hams, and pies, just as it had for 50 years. We gathered, cousins and their spouses chattering about jobs, kids, vacations. I noticed how Daniel and Martin positioned themselves near the head of the table, speaking in voices meant to be overheard. "Developers are offering serious money," Daniel said to no one in particular. "You could turn an old farm into something useful. Housing, maybe a shopping complex. Modern needs." Martin nodded, spearing a slice of ham. "And let's face it, Sam's done his part. But he's nearly 70. It's irresponsible to let one man cling to all that, when it could benefit everyone." The table fell quiet, eyes shifting toward me. Forks hesitated mid-air. Even the children seemed to sense the tension. I set down my knife and looked directly at the two of them. "If you think this land is yours to take, you've forgotten who kept it alive while you were off chasing boardrooms. I was here when the barn roof collapsed. I was here when the taxes nearly buried us. I was here when storms flattened crops, and I stood in the rain to replant." My voice didn't rise, but the firmness in it made a few at the table look down at their plates. Ruth reached across, laying her hand over mine. "That's enough for tonight," she said softly. But the damage had been done. I left early, stepping into the cool night air, the cicadas buzzing like static in the trees. Their whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were positioning, rehearsals for something bigger. And in my gut, I knew they weren't going to wait for me to hand over the estate. They were planning to take it. What I didn't yet know was how far they were willing to go, or how carefully they had already sharpened their knives, not of steel but of paper and ink. The moment it shifted from whispers to open attack came at a town barbecue, one of those long summer afternoons when the whole county gathers at the park. Smoke curled from grills, children raced each other with half-melted ice cream cones, and music played from an old set of speakers that buzzed more than they sang. I was standing near the lemonade stand, chatting with Earl Jenkins, an old friend from high school who still farmed soybeans just down the road. Earl was telling me about his grandson's college acceptance when I heard Daniel's voice rise above the crowd. He had that salesman's tone, polished enough to sound casual, but pitched so everyone around could hear. "Sam's still clinging to the old estate," he said, chuckling. "Bless him. But he's almost 70 now. It's a wonder he can even keep the books straight, let alone run all that land." A few people laughed uneasily. Earl frowned. I felt heat rise in my chest, not from the sun but from the sting of the words. Then Martin chimed in, holding a beer aloft like he was giving a toast. "Truth is, the estate needs younger hands, new vision, someone who can actually use it for the good of the family, not just let it rot with the barns." The laughter was louder this time, real, sharp, and it cut through me. I stepped forward, my boots heavy on the grass. "You two done?" I asked, my voice low but carrying. The circle of people grew quiet, eyes bouncing between us. Daniel smirked, his sunglasses reflecting the sun. "We're just being honest, Sam. Everyone's thinking it. You've had your time, but you're past your prime. It's time to let go." I stared at him, then at Martin, who nodded as if he were the judge delivering a verdict. My hands curled into fists at my sides, but I forced them open. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. Instead, I spoke calmly. "I may be older, but age isn't weakness. It's roots, and without roots, all your so-called vision blows away with the first storm." There was a murmur in the crowd, some approving, others skeptical. Daniel shrugged, as if I'd proven his point. "Roots are fine, Sam, but sometimes you have to cut down the old tree to build something useful." The words hit harder than any shove. A direct insult, a public dismissal, and for the first time, I realized their campaign wasn't just about money. It was about erasing me, reducing me to a relic, so no one would question when they took what I had kept alive. I walked away before my temper got the better of me, but the sound of their laughter trailed behind like smoke from a dying fire. That night, sitting alone on my porch with the ledger open on my lap, I traced my father's handwriting, faded but steady. He had built this place with his sweat, and I had carried it with mine. My cousins might laugh in public, but I knew something they had forgotten. Land remembers, paper remembers, and I swore to myself under that wide summer sky, if they wanted to insult me in front of the town, I would answer them in front of a judge. But first, I would need proof, and proof, like crops, takes time to grow. The insults I could stomach. Words are smoke, and I had weathered worse in my years. But betrayal, written in ink, that was something else entirely. It began quietly, with envelopes. The kind that don't arrive in your mailbox but land on other people's desks. One evening, Reverend Clay stopped by the estate with a puzzled look on his face. He held a folded letter in his hand. "Sam," he said gently, "I received this today. It says you've decided to step back from managing the property and ask me to support your cousins in assuming control." My heart thudded. I took the letter, unfolded it, and there was my name scrawled at the bottom. But it wasn't my hand. The loops of the S and the stiff line of the K were close, too close. Someone had studied my writing. "Did you believe it?" I asked quietly. Reverend Clay shook his head. "Not for a moment. I've known your handwriting since you signed the church books 20 years ago, but others may not be so discerning." He left the letter with me. I sat at the kitchen table long into the night, the clock ticking steady, the paper heavy under my palm. This was no longer rumor or insult. This was forgery. The next week, I heard from the bank. A polite but firm clerk called to confirm that I had authorized Daniel and Martin to discuss estate finances on my behalf. My jaw tightened as I explained, in no uncertain terms, that no such authorization existed. The clerk hesitated, then admitted he had seen documents with my signature attached. By then the truth was clear. My cousins weren't waiting for me to step aside. They were trying to shove me out, using papers instead of fists, signatures instead of knives. I confronted them once, outside the courthouse steps, after a zoning meeting. "You've been busy with your pens," I said, holding up the forged letter. Daniel didn't even flinch. "You're imagining things, Sam. People make mistakes with handwriting all the time." Martin smirked. "Besides, if you were smart, you'd thank us. We're doing the hard work of planning for the future, something you've clearly lost the strength for." Their arrogance burned hotter than the summer sun. They walked away, leaving me with the weight of their schemes pressing hard against my chest. That night, Ruth came by with supper in foil, as she often did when she sensed my spirits were low. I showed her the letter. She read it twice, her lips pressed thin. "They're getting desperate," she said. "But Sam, you can't just sit still. They're gathering allies." "I know," I replied. My voice was quiet but not weak. I touched the old family ledger still sitting on the shelf, thick with decades of real ink. If they want to play with paper, they've forgotten whose hands have been keeping the records all these years. Because the truth was this: paper can lie, but paper can also expose. And if they were forging documents to erase me, I would gather enough real ones to bury them. I blew out the lantern that night with a calm certainty. The betrayal had begun, but so had my preparation. The blow came harder than I expected. One crisp morning, as the sun lit the estate fields in gold, I received a thick envelope delivered by courier. Inside was a neatly bound packet, stamped with the county seal. Notice of transfer of management rights. Whitaker Estate. My blood ran cold as I turned the pages. According to the documents, I had signed over the management of the estate to Daniel and Martin. My signature, bold and sure, appeared at the bottom of every sheet. My name was there, my initials on margins, even the same peculiar loop I made when I wrote the letter. Only, it wasn't me. I set the papers down, my hands trembling not with age but with fury. They hadn't just forged a letter this time. They had forged ownership. They were declaring in legal ink that I was stepping aside and the estate was theirs to command. The audacity of it almost stole my breath. To think they believed I would be too weary, too old, too slow to fight back. By afternoon, word had already begun to spread. At the post office, a clerk I'd known for decades looked at me with thinly veiled pity. "Heard you finally let the young ones take charge," she said. "Maybe it's for the best." At the diner, two men at the counter nodded as I walked past. "Smart of Sam to let go," one muttered. "Would have been a shame to see the land wasted." The humiliation was heavier than any insult they'd ever thrown. They weren't just attacking my pride, they were rewriting my story, erasing my stewardship, painting me as a man who had surrendered. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread before me. The clock ticked like a gavel. My father's ledger sat open beside the forged papers, the real ink of his hand contrasting the false lines of mine. Ruth came by again, her worry etched deeper each time she saw me. She read the documents, her lips tightening as she turned each page. "Sam," she whispered, "This looks official." "It looks official," I agreed. "But paper lies when a hand is corrupt. And these hands," I tapped the signatures, "aren't mine." She leaned closer. "You'll need proof, not just your word against theirs." I nodded slowly. Proof. That was the key. Every storm needs a nail to hold the roof against it. I spent that night digging through drawers, cabinets, and boxes. Old contracts, tax receipts, letters written in my hand over decades. Each one a piece of the puzzle, a comparison that would reveal the forgery for what it was. I stacked them neatly, feeling the weight of years on my side. My cousins believed they were clever, hiding behind their polished lawyers and fraudulent ink. But they had underestimated two things: the sharp eye of a man who had balanced ledgers his whole life, and the patience of one who had spent 68 years holding his family's ground. When the time came, I would place their forged papers beside my true ones. And then in front of a judge, we would see whose ink would stand and whose would bleed away like lies in the rain. News of the so-called transfer spread faster than a brush fire. By the next Sunday, the Whitaker family dinner felt less like a gathering and more like a tribunal. Ruth had set the table as she always did. Ham at the center, potatoes steaming, pies cooling by the window. But the conversation had a sharpness that cut through the aroma of food. Daniel and Martin arrived in tailored jackets, carrying themselves with the confidence of men, convinced the future already belonged to them. Their spouses followed, offering tight smiles, while the younger cousins whispered at the far end of the table. I noticed how many of them avoided my eyes, as though I were a patient in decline, whose illness no one wanted to name. Halfway through the meal, Daniel cleared his throat dramatically. "I suppose we should address the obvious," he said, looking down the table toward me. "As most of you know, Uncle Sam has wisely decided to let us manage the estate moving forward. It's time the next generation took the reins." A few relatives nodded, more out of discomfort than agreement. Martin added, "It's for the best. The estate needs energy, modern direction. We'll make sure it thrives for everyone." I set down my fork deliberately. "I never signed those papers," I said evenly. The room fell still. "They're forgeries, every last one." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the table. My cousin Laura, always quick to take sides, frowned. "But the documents, your signatures on them, Sam." I met her gaze. "And do you think my hand suddenly changed after 60 years of writing checks, contracts, and ledgers? Look closer. They're imitations, nothing more." Daniel leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Come now, Sam. Nobody's going to believe you over official documents. Maybe your memory's slipping. That happens at your age." The words stung sharper than I let show. Ruth slammed her hand against the table, dishes rattling. "That's enough," she snapped. "I know my brother's hand better than anyone. Those signatures aren't his." But the damage had been done. Half the family sat in tense silence, caught between loyalty and greed. The other half whispered among themselves, calculating what side offered more benefit. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just fighting Daniel and Martin. I was fighting the erosion of trust within my own bloodline. When the meal ended, I rose slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood. "You've made your move," I told them. "But remember this, truth doesn't vanish because you wish it to. I'll see you in court if I must." Daniel chuckled as though I'd told a joke. Martin smiled thinly. "We'll be ready," he said. As I stepped out into the cool night, the cicadas loud in the trees, I felt the weight of betrayal settle fully. My cousins hadn't just tried to steal land. They'd tried to sever my place in the family's story. But they had forgotten one thing. The story wasn't finished yet, and I was still holding the pen. The following weeks tested every ounce of patience I had learned in nearly 7 decades of living. My cousins strutted around town as though the estate already belonged to them, dropping hints to developers, bragging about upcoming projects, and flashing forged documents like trophies. Most people didn't challenge them. After all, papers with seals and signatures look convincing to the untrained eye. But I didn't waste my energy arguing in the streets or chasing rumors. I've always believed that silence, when sharpened, cuts deeper than noise. Instead, I prepared. I began with my father's old ledger, spread open across the dining table like a battlefield map. Inside were dozens of pages in his hand, and mine, side by side. They showed a lifetime of authentic ink. Contracts for feed, receipts for lumber, tax forms signed every year without fail. My writing had its quirks. The loop of the say, the downward hook of the r, quirks a forger can imitate, but never replicate consistently. Next, I visited old friends who still carried influence. Earl at the lumber yard, Reverend Clay at the church, Denise from the credit union. Each of them remembered moments when my word alone had steadied a crisis. When I asked if they'd testify to my character and to the steadiness of my hand, they agreed without hesitation. Loyalty is like a seed planted long ago. In the right season, it grows back toward you. I also paid a quiet visit to the county clerk's office. The young clerk, nervous but helpful, allowed me to review the original deed filings. I requested certified copies of every signature I'd ever placed there over the years. The stack grew heavy, but with each page my case grew stronger. Meanwhile, Daniel and Martin underestimated me completely. They mistook my silence for surrender, whispering to relatives that I was too tired to fight. They even arranged a meeting with a real estate developer from the city, boasting over dinner at the diner that the estate would soon be repurposed for modern use. I heard all this not because I spied, but because arrogance speaks loudly when it thinks it's already won. Ruth visited often, her presence a steady comfort. One evening she asked, "Sam, are you sure you're up for this fight?" I looked at her across the lamplight, papers stacked neatly beside us. "Ruth, I've spent my whole life mending fences and balancing ledgers. Fighting isn't new, it just looks different now. I may be old, but I'm not finished." She smiled faintly, pride softening her worry. By the time the court date arrived, I was ready. My cousins would walk into that room with their forged papers and smug grins, but I would walk in with decades of truth in my hands and a lifetime of integrity standing behind me. They believed the estate was theirs already. What they didn't realize was that while they played at being businessmen, I had been laying the foundation for justice brick by brick. And soon the gavel would fall, not on me, but on them. The summons arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a deputy with a grim expression. "Samuel Whitaker," he said, holding out the envelope. "You've been named in a petition filed by Daniel and Martin Whitaker." I thanked him, though my chest tightened as I opened the thick stack of papers. Inside was their claim that I had willingly signed over management of the estate, that I was unfit due to age and declining faculties, and that the court should recognize them as rightful overseers of the Whitaker property. Age and declining faculties. They'd reduced me to a caricature, a feeble old man too confused to know what he'd signed. I sat at the kitchen table, the steady tick of the clock mocking their words. My hands trembled, not from weakness but from anger. By afternoon, I drove to the office of an attorney I'd known since he was fresh out of law school. Thomas Granger, now grey at the temples, but sharp as a tack. He greeted me with a firm handshake. "Sam," I heard whispers. I hoped they weren't true. "They're true," I said, laying down the forged documents. "But so are these." I opened the satchel I had carried, spilling decades of authentic papers across his desk. Deeds, receipts, tax forms, letters, every one in my handwriting. Thomas studied them with a careful eye. These signatures of theirs, close but inconsistent. Anyone with training in handwriting analysis will spot the differences. They've overplayed their hand. I leaned back, exhaustion momentarily weighing on me. They think the town believes them already. They think the court will side with their Polish and youth. Thomas smiled thinly. "The law doesn't bow to Polish, Sam. It bows to evidence, and you've got plenty." We spent hours drafting responses, assembling exhibits, compiling a list of witnesses who could attest to my steady hand and clear mind. Earl from the lumber yard, Reverend Clay, Denise from the credit union, even Ruth, all ready to stand beside me. When the paperwork was filed, the case became official. Whitaker v. Whitaker. The irony wasn't lost on me. Blood against blood, cousins against cousin, all over land that was supposed to unite us. Word spread quickly through town. Some shook their heads, muttering that family shouldn't drag each other into court. Others quietly approached me at church or in the market, offering their support. "We know what you've done for that estate, Sam," they whispered. "Don't let them take it." Daniel and Martin, for their part, strutted through the streets as though victory was already theirs. I saw them once outside the bank, laughing with a developer in a tailored suit. Daniel caught my eye, smirked, and said loudly, "Old Sam's fighting windmills. The court will see reason." I didn't answer. Let them mistake silence for surrender, because deep down, I knew what they didn't. This wasn't just a fight for land. It was a fight for truth, for dignity, for the years I had poured into soil and stone while they chased comfort elsewhere. The spark had been lit. The case was on the docket, and soon, in a courtroom filled with polished wood and the smell of old paper, my cousins would learn that age is not weakness, it is endurance. The courthouse in Maplewood is not a grand place. It's a squat brick building with a white cupola and creaky wooden floors that remember every step. But to me, that building has always felt heavier than stone. Justice weighs more than any beam I've ever lifted, and on the morning of our first hearing, I could feel that weight pressing on my shoulders. I walked in with Thomas Granger at my side, my satchel stuffed with decades of ledgers and documents. The air smelled faintly of coffee and dust, and the murmurs of townsfolk gathered on the benches carried the flavor of gossip. Everyone loves a family feud, especially when it involves land older than most of the people in the room. At the far side of the aisle sat Daniel and Martin, dressed in sharp suits that looked borrowed from some city tailor. Their wives sat behind them, lips pursed, eyes gleaming with triumph before the gavel had even struck. Daniel caught my eye and smirked, as though the verdict were already written in his favor. When the judge entered, the room rose. Judge Margaret Alcott was a woman with silver hair tied back in a no-nonsense knot, her gaze steady and sharp behind thin spectacles. She had presided over disputes in this county for 30 years and had a reputation for slicing through arrogance with the precision of a blade. "Whitaker vert Whitaker," she called, her voice filling the chamber. "Petitioners Daniel and Martin Whitaker, respondents Samuel Whitaker. Let us proceed." Their lawyer, a slick man from the city named Brennan, rose first. He painted a picture of me as a tired old man, too frail to manage the estate, vulnerable to confusion. He paraded the forged documents with theatrical flair, laying them on the evidence table like relics. "Here is Mr. Whitaker's own signature," Brennan declared, tapping the papers. "Proof that he willingly ceded control. The cousins have stepped forward not out of greed, but responsibility." I sat silent, my jaw tight, my fingers resting on the satchel at my feet. Each lie stacked like tinder, and I waited for the match. Then it was Thomas's turn. He spoke with calm authority, outlining the decades I had stewarded the land, the repairs I had made, the taxes I had paid. He gestured toward me. "This man is no relic, Your Honor. He is the very reason the estate still stands." Then he lifted one of my authentic ledgers. "And as for these supposed signatures, well, we will see how they hold under the light of scrutiny." The judge nodded once, expression unreadable. She called for recess until the handwriting expert could be scheduled, and the room buzzed with murmurs. As I stood to leave, Daniel leaned toward me, his voice low and venomous. "You should have just stepped aside, Sam. You're going to embarrass yourself." I looked him straight in the eye. Better to embarrass myself in the truth than live comfortably in a lie. He scoffed, but for the first time, I saw something flicker in his expression, not confidence, but doubt. Walking out of the courthouse into the bright sun, I felt the ground shift underfoot. The shadows of lies had been cast. Soon, evidence would cut through them like daylight. And when it did, it wouldn't just expose their forgery, it would strip them bare in front of the very town they had tried to deceive. The handwriting expert arrived from the city 2 weeks later, a man named Dr. Conrad, whose spectacles perched so far down his nose, I wondered how they stayed in place. He carried with him a leather case, worn smooth at the corners, filled with magnifiers, inks, and a calm confidence that seemed to unsettle my cousins more than any lawyer could. Court reconvened on a grey morning, the kind where clouds pressed low, as if the sky itself wanted to bear witness. The benches were crowded again. Neighbors, farmers, even a few developers sniffing around for opportunity. All of them hungry to see which Whitaker would leave with dignity and which with disgrace. Brennan, my cousin's lawyer, went first. He strutted to the front, holding the forged documents like holy scripture. "Dr. Conrad," he said, his voice slick with certainty, "please confirm for the court that this is indeed Mr. Samuel Whitaker's signature." Conrad adjusted his spectacles, peered at the page, then asked, "And which Samuel Whitaker signature are you referring to? The one written with hesitation, or the one with artificial flourish?" The room chuckled softly. Judge Alcott rapped her gavel. "Proceed." Conrad opened his case, laying out tools with the precision of a surgeon. He compared the forged documents with the stack of authentic papers I had provided, tax records, deeds, letters spanning decades. With each comparison, he explained the small details, the angle of my T, the pressure of my pen strokes, the way my S curled naturally without pause. "These," he said, tapping the forged papers, "were created by someone mimicking. See the tremor here? The ink pools unnaturally, as though the hand paused too long. And here the flourish of the curd in Whitaker, dramatic, inconsistent with Mr. Whitaker's lifelong style." Brennan shifted uncomfortably, but Daniel and Martin sat frozen, their earlier smugness drained. When Thomas rose, he handed Conrad one final piece, a letter I had written just months before, thanking Reverend Clay for his help at the garden. Conrad held it beside the forged transfer. "The difference," he said, his voice calm but final, "is as stark as night and day. No trained examiner, or even an observant layman, would mistake one for the other. These signatures are forgeries." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judge Alcott leaned forward. "You are certain, Doctor?" "Beyond any professional doubt," Conrad replied. Thomas seized the moment. He stepped to the center, turning toward the judge. "Your Honor, this case is not about age, nor about stewardship. It is about deception, an attempt by Daniel and Martin Whitaker to strip a man of his legacy through fraud." The evidence speaks plainly. The estate belongs where it always has, with Samuel Whitaker. Silence filled the room, broken only by the scratching of the clerk's pen. My cousins sat pale, their lawyer whispering furiously, but offering no defense strong enough to cover the cracks. For the first time since this began, I felt the scales tip, not with thunder, not with spectacle, just with the steady weight of truth, landing where it belonged. The forged papers that once humiliated me now lay exposed, powerless under the light. And soon the gavel would echo what I had known all along. You cannot erase a man who has lived his life in honesty, no matter how many false signatures you scrawl. The day of judgment arrived with a sharp autumn wind that rattled the courthouse windows. I buttoned my old wool coat, the one that had carried me through decades of winters, and walked inside with Ruth on my arm. The benches were packed tighter than ever. Neighbors, townsfolk, even a reporter from the county paper scribbling in his notebook. Everyone wanted to see how far family betrayal could stretch before snapping. Judge Alcott entered, her robe flowing like the storm itself. She wasted no time. This court has reviewed the expert testimony, the evidence of authentic signatures spanning decades, and the glaring inconsistencies in the petitioner's documents. The conclusion is inescapable. Her eyes lifted, hard as stone. The signatures attributed to Samuel Whitaker on the transfer of management are forgeries. Fraud has been attempted before this court. The words struck like thunder. A hush fell across the room. Daniel shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, Martin's face drained of color. Brennan, their lawyer, tried to rise, but the judge silenced him with a glare. Therefore, she continued, her gavel poised, the petition is dismissed in its entirety. Full management and ownership of the Whitaker estate remain with Samuel Whitaker. Furthermore, this court refers the matter of forgery to the county prosecutor for potential criminal charges. The gavel came down, one sharp crack that echoed through the chamber like a rifle shot. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sound settle into me. Not joy, not gloating, just vindication, steady and sure. Ruth squeezed my hand, tears in her eyes. Behind us, I heard Earl whisper, "Knew Sam wouldn't let them win." Reverend Clay murmured, "Justice, at last." But at the other side of the room, silence festered around my cousins. Daniel stared at the table, unable to meet a single eye. Martin's shoulders slumped as though the air had left him entirely. Their wives fidgeted, faces pale with embarrassment. The town had seen it all. Their arrogance, their lies, their fall. As I stood, Judge Alcott looked at me directly. "Mr. Whitaker, this court commends your diligence. Age is not decline when paired with integrity. You have upheld both." I bowed my head slightly. "Thank you, Your Honor." Walking out of the courthouse into the crisp autumn air, I felt the weight of months lift from my shoulders. The estate was safe, my name untarnished, the truth written not only on paper, but in the eyes of every witness who had watched justice play out. For years my cousins had mocked my age, painted me as relic, dismissed me as weak. Today a single gavel proved what they never understood. Patience is not weakness. It is power waiting for its moment. And when the moment came, the gavel fell for me, not for them. The verdict spread through Maplewood faster than wildfire. By the next morning, folks at the diner were already shaking their heads over steaming mugs of coffee. "Imagine trying to steal from your own kin," one man muttered, "and forging papers at that." Another replied, "They thought Sam wouldn't fight back. They forgot whose name built that land." Daniel and Martin, once so quick to strut through town with their polished shoes and polished lies, now walked in shadows. Developers who once leaned in to hear their promises suddenly stopped returning calls. Banks that had entertained their pitches quietly withdrew interest. Even neighbors who had smiled politely now crossed the street to avoid them. But their fall wasn't only public, it was financial. The court's referral to the prosecutor had teeth. Legal fees stacked up quickly. The developer they'd courted demanded repayment for wasted time. The bank called in debts they'd stretched too thin. The shiny SUV disappeared from Daniel's driveway, replaced by a used pickup that sputtered smoke. Martin sold his boat, then his second car, but still the creditors circled. One evening, as I was walking back from the barn, I saw them both standing at the far edge of the road, staring toward the estate. Their figures looked smaller, diminished. They didn't see me, but I saw the hollowness in their stance. Pride had been their fuel, and now it had burned out. Ruth told me later they'd tried to come by her house, spinning apologies that stumbled over themselves. She listened politely, but didn't let them inside. "You nearly ruined my brother," she told them. Apologies come cheap after lies that heavy. At church, the Reverend welcomed them as he would anyone, but when he spoke his sermon that week, his words seemed aimed squarely at them. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Even their own children felt the sting. At school, whispers followed them. "Your dad tried to cheat Uncle Sam." The humiliation trickled down, leaving Daniel and Martin more isolated than they had ever been. And through it all, I said nothing. No speeches, no gloating, just silence. The kind of silence that reminds a man that consequences don't need trumpets, they need time. The estate remained mine, steady as the oaks that lined its fences. I walked the land each morning, boots crunching on the gravel, the air clearer than it had been in years. The soil beneath my feet felt even more alive, as though it knew it had survived a storm meant to uproot it. My cousins had believed age was weakness, that time had made me irrelevant, but in the end, it was time itself that revealed the truth. And their fall was not sudden, like a toppled tower. It was slow, grinding, humiliating. The kind of fall you can't hide from neighbors, from creditors, or from yourself. The land endured. I endured. They did not. After the trial and the slow unraveling of my cousin's pride, life at the estate settled into a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. Each morning I walked the fence line with my cane tapping the stones, not because I needed it, but because it reminded me of the steadiness that had carried me through storms. The air smelled cleaner. The soil felt richer under my boots. Perhaps nothing had changed in the land itself, but in me, everything had. Around town, the whispers shifted. Where once they'd said, "Sam's too old," or "he can't handle the estate anymore," they now said, "Sam stood his ground, and the old man had more fight than the young ones ever guessed." At the diner, chairs were pulled out for me before I reached the table. At church, Reverend Clay shook my hand a little longer, his eyes bright with respect. Even the clerk at the bank, who once spoke to me with doubt in her tone, now greeted me with warmth. Vindication, I learned, doesn't arrive with fanfare. It arrives in nods across grocery aisles, in neighbors who stop to ask advice about their fences, in children who wave when you drive past. It arrives in silence, steady as the turning of seasons. Daniel and Martin stayed quiet. They still lived in town, but their swagger had vanished. They spoke in hushed tones when they had to, heads down, eyes avoiding mine. Every time they passed me on the street, it was like a shadow shrinking before the sun. And though part of me longed to say, "I told you so," I never did. The silence was enough. One evening, Ruth and I sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in streaks of orange and violet. She turned to me and said, "You didn't just save the estate, Sam. You saved the family name." I thought about that for a long while. The Whitaker estate wasn't just mine. It was memory, sweat, a promise carried across generations. My cousins had tried to erase me, but in the end it was their names that faded. Mine remained, etched not just in deeds and documents, but in the soil itself. "Funny thing about truth," I finally said to Ruth. "It doesn't shout, it waits, and when the time comes, it stands taller than any lie." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "And so do you, brother." That night, as the crickets sang and the stars blinked awake, I realized that vindication isn't about defeating your enemies. It's about standing firm enough that the world can't mistake where strength truly lies. I had been mocked for my age, dismissed for my silence, nearly erased by false ink. But in the end, it was those very things, age, silence, patience, that carried me to victory. And now, with the estate safe and the truth unshaken, I could finally rest in the quiet certainty that justice had found its way home. Winter came to Maplewood like a clean slate, laying a hush of snow across the fields of the Whitaker estate. The barns stood strong, their roofs frosted white, and the old farmhouse glowed warmly at dusk, as though it knew it had survived yet another storm. I sat by the window with a cup of black coffee, watching the flakes drift, and thought of all that had passed. My cousins had tried to erase me with forged papers. They had mocked my age, counted on the town's doubts, and believed ink could overwrite a lifetime of sweat. Yet here I was, 68 years old, still standing, still holding the land that had carried my family's name for generations. The soil beneath the snow was mine to walk, mine to guard, mine to pass on when the time came. Not stolen, not surrendered, earned. In town, people no longer whispered. They greeted me with respect. Some even apologized for having doubted me. I didn't rub salt in those wounds. Dignity doesn't require gloating. I simply nodded, knowing that the truth had already spoken loud enough. As for Daniel and Martin, they had disappeared from the center of things. Their debts had cornered them. Their reputations had collapsed. They lived smaller lives now, quiet ones, with the weight of disgrace heavy on their shoulders. And though a part of me still smarted from their betrayal, I felt no need to chase vengeance further. The gavel had spoken, and time was delivering the rest. On the first Sunday of Advent, Ruth sat with me at church. When the final hymn ended, she whispered, "Sam, do you realize what you've done? You've shown them that strength isn't youth or wealth. It's endurance, it's truth." I smiled, not because I sought recognition, but because I knew she was right. Age hadn't weakened me. It had steadied me. It had given me the patience to wait while their lies tangled themselves, until the truth stood unshaken. That night, I opened my father's old ledger one last time. At the very bottom of a blank page, I wrote a single line: "Legacy cannot be stolen, it must be lived." Then I closed the book, set it back on the shelf, and listened to the steady ticking of the clock in the farmhouse kitchen, the same clock that had ticked through insults, betrayals, and vindication. Its rhythm reminded me that justice doesn't always come in shouts or fury. Sometimes it arrives like snow, quiet, inevitable, and with it comes peace. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments whether you believe age makes us weaker or wiser. Your voice matters here.